Hello all. So today we'll be talking about Azure AD and various concepts inside Azure AD such as enterprise applications, app registrations, and various authentication token grant flows that are present and supported as a part of Azure AD. Now let's take a quick example before we dive deep into the technological aspects of it. Now just assume that you're going to an airport. Now this person, being you, is stopped by the security guard whenever you try to enter into an airport. If you want to go into a domestic launch or basically domestic side of the airport, you gotta present your air ticket, or you gotta give your, and with respect to, in addition to the air ticket, you're also expected to give your ID proof, which it might be your Aadhaar card, or if you're staying in the United States, probably it'll be some sort of authentication, which is maybe a driver's license, or if you're staying in some other place, it will be a government registered authenticated driver's license. Now, if you're trying to do the same thing to an international place, they're going to ask you for a passport. So the point here is the security guard is trusting on a document which is presented or which is provided by a government or an entity which is considered to be trusted. So there is an implicit trust between these two entities, and there is an implicit trust by the security guards towards this entity that has issued these documents. Now, let us take the same example of in a typical authentication flow for a typical web application. Now, how would that look like? You are a person, you are trying to visit a web application, and you are asked to enter a username and password. That is a typical authentication flow, and this username and password is actually stored in the backend database of this particular application. Now, the problem with a typical enterprise is if you're using too many applications like this. Now, for example, as a part of your, if you're working somewhere, you'll understand that for email you use one application, for chatting you use another application, and for storing files you're going to use another application. Now, all these applications will end up storing a specific set of your username and password. Now, we being humans, we tend to reuse these passwords as well. Now, if this password gets breached, you're left vulnerable in this particular website and this particular website as well. And also, on the other hand, if this particular company ends up not storing a password securely, then this data in this particular company or in this particular website is out there for the hackers to take to sort of steal. Now, the whole idea of a federated identity system came wherein there will be a person whose identity will be stored with an IDP. In short, and the full form of this IDP is identity provider. Now, this identity provider will have your username, your password, your metadata, which is your name, your father's name, or where you live, and other information. What are your preferences? What is your personal blog address, etc., etc., and what is your phone number and stuff like that. And this particular website, wherever you visit, you have something called as login with this IDP. You have a button which will allow you to redirect to basically log in using these credentials, so you don't end up sort of using multiple passwords at multiple levels. Now, with this model, there is again one problem. You can't give your password to multiple websites and say, hey, go and validate with my IDP, because then again, if these websites end up storing this password, what is the point of having another IDP? So there has to be a mechanism where there should be a user who is basically storing his or her credentials or their credentials in an IDP, and there is going to be a website or an app, let's call it an app for now. This app has to talk to this IDP and has to get the information of this user without the user actually giving a password to this application. So this is where we have several industry standard mechanisms. So this particular concept of whatever we have seen so far, it's called single sign-on. And there are several standards that are implemented for this, like ADFS, SAML, and we also have a version of OAuth that allows you to basically, do this authentication and single sign-on. Now, in Azure AD, in the in sense of Azure AD, this IDP is your Azure AD, and this application is your application that a company is providing its services for. Now, for example, a very popular application for signing your documents, it's called DocuSign, right? So let's assume that there is an app called DocSign, which is something like a DocuSign app, a document signing application. Now, if you are asked to do, if your organization is using this application, what you would do typically is what this company would do, it will create an application with all the metadata in it, and it is done by using something called as app registration. Now, inside app registration, if you see the Azure portal, you have something called as app registration. And this app registration is for the developers to share their application across to multiple tenants. So a new registration, you would say, hey, I want to share this with multiple people in any organizational directory. So as you already know, tenant is basically a logical boundary for an Azure organization. And this particular tenant, if you want to share it only to your user, so for example, if it's an internal application, you would select the first option, which is this directory only. And if it's an application that you want to share it with other customers across Azure, so you would go ahead and say, hey, I want people from across other places to use this application. And you would also give something called as the redirect URI. We will come back to that redirect URI at a later point in this video. But the point is, once you create an application, which will be something like this. Now, this is an application that I've created for this tenant. There will be an application identifier, there'll be an object ID for this application, and there'll be secrets that you can configure. Now, this is basic application that we've talked about. Now, a very interesting part that you will see inside Azure AD is enterprise applications. Now, the concept of this particular enterprise application and Azure AD is that instance of app registration is created in every tenant that this application is being used. For example, if you see this tenant, which is tenant 1, which has awesome SaaS app.onmicrosoft.com, this is the tenant name, and tenant 2 is super SaaS app.onmicrosoft.com. Now, these two tenants are the two vendors who are providing services to various Azure customers. Now, in the sense that they've created two app registrations, so this is an app registration and this is an app registration, the same way we have done, and they've selected the option of multi-tenant authentication. And there is an object of service principal that is created with the same data in the tenant, and wherever this application instance is being used, there is a service principal or enterprise app registration which is created in all the tenants that are used. For example, tenant 3 consumerorg.onmicrosoft.com uses this application, and that is why an instance of this particular app is created as a service principal under enterprise app registrations. For example, if you go to enterprise applications, you would see that I've created Azure Hound as an app registration, and with the same name and same properties, an enterprise application was created, which in fact is a service principal. Now, to give you a perspective of service providers, if I create a new application, you already have a list of applications which I was mentioning about right now. For example, if you're using SAP, or if you're using Oracle services, or if you're using any of these top SaaS applications, you could quickly click on one of them and you could add them as a part of your tenant as well. So what this would allow is anyone who is a part of your organization, if they have an account on Atlassian Cloud, they would be easily able to log in using single sign-on using this particular mechanism. Now, there might be, in certain cases, additional configuration that might be required, like assigning users and assigning applications to a specific user, but this is at a high level what enterprise app versus app registration is. Now, how does this typical authentication flow work when we talk about enterprise apps and app registration? Is we do have a bunch of token grant flows that Microsoft Azure AD supports today. So there are around 6 token grant flows that we'll be talking about, namely auth code grant, client credentials grant, device code flow, on behalf flow, implicit grant flow, and resource owner password credentials. And on top of that, we'll also